Well, I think thug is a compliment to Putin, or using the word thug as an insult to thugs by describing Putin is much worse than a thug. Putin is a psychopath. He is absolutely has no emotion when it comes to suffering of his people. It just doesn't even touch him, and as such, he's more in the category of a Stalin or a Hitler than in some type of just garden variety kleptocrat. I mean, he's really in a whole category by himself in terms of the evil that he's able to inflict on his enemies, his neighbors, and his own people.
So we're approaching the 4-year anniversary of the full-scale invasion in February of Ukraine by Russia. And it was 3 years ago that you told me the war would escalate and get really nasty. And unfortunately, it has. Where do you see this war going now?
Well, so the first thing I would say is that it's been the Putin's invasion has been a complete disaster and catastrophe for Russia, not to mention Ukraine, but for Russia. They've lost either through death or disability 1.2 million young men, soldiers, in this invasion, and they've accumulated almost no incremental territory for those losses, and so it's really, I guess it lays bare this myth that Russia has this superpower status, that they have a military that's so amazing, and so on. It doesn't. Their military is corrupt, inept, and basically suicidal for anybody who's a part of it. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that it's effectively a frozen conflict. It's not frozen in terms of missiles and bombs and drones and so on fighting back and forth, but it's a frozen conflict in the sense that Russia's not making any significant territorial gains, and every effort that they make to try for those territorial gains just results in massive catastrophe and death for their people. They're losing 1,000 soldiers a day, so they keep on pushing, but they're not getting anywhere, and they're experiencing great losses on the battlefield. And so I would say that if we were to look into the future, people say, well, when's this war going to end? And the answer is, I don't believe it's going to end. I think that it will be redefined in some point when it'll be effectively a frozen conflict like other frozen conflicts in which nobody declares an end to the war, but there's nothing being gained from either side. The reason why it's not going to end is because Putin has to be at war for his own personal and political survival. He needs a war to distract the Russian people from his own failings as a leader. He doesn't want people to be mad at him. He wants them to be mad at a foreign enemy. He needs that to stay in power, and he needs to be in power in order to stay alive, because if he wasn't in power, the system would eat him up almost immediately, and he'd probably certainly be arrested, certainly impoverished, and probably killed. So Putin is going to carry on. And I can also say that the Ukrainians understand full well what will happen if Russia were to occupy their territory. If they were to say, we surrender, you can do what you want, then the basic model for that is Bucha. Bucha is a suburb of Kiev that was taken over for a short period of time after the initial invasion in February 2022. And in Bucha, all the women were raped, all the men were tortured and killed, and all the children were kidnapped. And so the Ukrainians understand that that's their fate if they were to surrender and allow Russia to occupy big parts of Ukraine. And so they're not going to surrender. And that leads us to this frozen conflict. And so the only thing that could happen, which would change the calculus, is if for some reason Europe decides that they no longer want to support Ukraine. And I should point out, when I mention Europe, I'm specifically not mentioning the United States, because the United States has already said they're not supporting Ukraine, but Europe is. So as long as Europe continues to support Ukraine, as long as Ukraine continues to get financial and military aid, they'll continue to be able to hold the line. And so that is where we are. There's not going to be any great peace deal done, negotiated by Donald Trump. There's not going to be a peace deal negotiated by Trump because Putin doesn't want to negotiate that peace deal. And so this will carry on, unfortunately.
The 1.23 million losses that Russia is suffering, or has suffered, how is Putin surviving that? And how long can that go on for? Is there a method to that madness, those meat wave attacks?
The reason why Putin is doing it is that he believes that we're going to buckle before he does, that the West will fracture, that political leadership changes in the West. And when it does, there'll be a different opinion about supporting Ukraine. And he's been not wrong about that. Look at the United States of America. Under President Biden, it was, we're here until Ukraine succeeds. All of a sudden, Biden is not president. Trump comes in and says, we don't want to spend another penny on Ukraine. And so that's what Putin is betting on for the rest of the world. And he can bet on that because he's got this unbelievable capacity to stomach losses. So 1.2 million men would lead to a complete political disaster in a country that has politics. But Russia doesn't have politics. When I say it doesn't have politics, it means that there is nobody is going to elect somebody else. Putin is not going to lose his position in power. Why? Because Putin is not in a democratic country. Putin is in a totalitarian dictatorship. And why do the people put up with it? Because they have no choice. Right now, you either put up with it, or if you protest it, then you get arrested, tortured, and killed. And so the average Russian says, there's no way out of this whole thing. We just have to suffer our losses and hope something changes in the future, but there's nothing that they're going to change on their own. And so he can carry on doing this for as long as he can. And that doesn't mean that the Russian people have infinite tolerance. There might be a moment in time when he does something which just enrages the people to such an extent that they rise up. But if they rise up, I think we can look at Iran as the model, which is that Putin wouldn't have any reservations about killing 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, even 100,000 of his own citizens, the way the Iranians have just done, if that was what he needed to do to stay in power. And so it's a very unpleasant situation for the average Russian, and it's certainly, of course, extremely unpleasant for the Ukrainians who are bearing the brunt of this psychotic madman.
Since 2024, Russia has gained 1.5% of Ukrainian territory, but they're ramping up the terror. So they have a goal of 1,000 drone attacks a day this year on Ukraine. Can Ukraine survive this bombardment?
Well, so this is Putin's big bet. He can't win on the battlefield, so he's going to try to demoralize and torture the average Ukrainian so that they no longer want to put up a fight. And the answer is, I don't think he'll succeed. I think he can do a lot of damage to Ukraine, as he's done. I mean, what's happening in Ukraine as we speak is unthinkable. It's freezing there. It's unbelievably cold. And he's knocking out power plants and heating plants so that the average Ukrainian person living in Kiev or Kharkiv or other places is literally freezing in their apartments. And it's hard to even imagine how pervasive that is. Every single person is subject to this. And being cold is really unpleasant. But the one thing that Putin doesn't have going for him is the seasons. We're sort of 5 or 6 weeks away from the cold to dissipate. And when it cold dissipates, then it will warm up and it won't be so torturous. And I don't know how the Ukrainians will solve this problem of all these drone attacks. I know that it's not, their suffering is not going unnoticed by Europe. And I know that the fixing of the infrastructure and defense of the skies is a super high priority for the West. And so all Ukraine needs to do is get through the next 5 weeks, and then we can think about, how do we prepare for next winter and what other methods and measures can be put in place. And I don't think the Ukrainians are going to give up because of this. But that's Putin's really his only hope. He can't win militarily on the battlefield. And so his only hope is to either demoralize the Ukrainians so they don't want to fight back, or to try to force some illegitimate political solution coming from President Trump to effectively surrender.
A big shift has been in terms of an oil war, so taking out the shadow fleet and deep strikes by Ukraine on Russian oil refineries. How effective is that?
The objective of all this is that if Putin runs out of money or doesn't have as much money, then he can't afford to pay as many soldiers. He can't afford to buy as much weaponry. He's got to also weigh up the balance between, how much money does he spend on domestic needs versus military, because people will start grumbling, and if they're left really high and dry economically. And if we can somehow cut off that flow of money to Putin, it does put pressure on him, real pressure. And so, we're arguing in the West about how to deal with the shadow fleet, how to deal with the Indian, Chinese, and Turkish oil refineries that buy the oil. But while we're sort of prevaricating and saying on one hand and on the other, Vladimir Zelensky is going out and sinking the shadow fleet tankers that are taking the oil. And I believe there's been about 5 that have been either destroyed or immobilized. And I'm sure for each of the ones that have been destroyed and immobilized, the other people who are sailing around with Russian oil are either doing so with great fear or maybe even not doing so. I'm also aware that some of the Western sanctions have affected some of the buyers of the Russian oil. And so, for example, some of the Indian oil refineries are now buying a lot less Russian oil. And as a result of that, there's a lot of Russian oil that's sitting in these tankers offshore in India, even offshore in China. And the price of the Russian oil has dropped. And I understand it to be somewhere between $20 and $30 a barrel, which is pretty painful for Putin, very painful for him. And so I think he's going to be suffering because of that. And if we can continue, both the Ukrainians and the West can continue to put pressure on Russia's oil exports, that will have a big impact on his ability to continue this war.
As much as Vladimir Putin wants to, he won't live forever. What happens then when he dies?
I think that when Putin is not around, whoever takes over can blame the war on Putin and negotiate some type of peace deal. Putin is completely invested in this. Whoever's next, they might not be our cup of tea. They might be some really horrible people. They might be pretty much status quo people. But this war of Putin's really is his war. And it is totally senseless war, of course, for the Ukrainians, but also for the Russians. I mean, Putin has achieved none of the objectives he set out. If he was trying to stop NATO, which is, I believe, a red herring, I don't think it has anything to do with NATO, but if that was his true objective, he ends up with Finland and Sweden now joining NATO in the process. If this is about territory, as we've said, they've gained 1.2% of Ukraine's territory since 2024. That hasn't worked, and in the process, they've lost hundreds of billions of dollars of economic resources and more than 1.2 million men. And so, whoever takes over, is going to look at all that and say, I think that we can probably figure out another way to characterize this whole thing, sell it as a win, and stop. Putin's the guy who needs this war, but not sure that any successor will need this war.
In the time since the war, we've seen the USA take action in Venezuela, Iran, Russia's so-called client states. What do they make of Russia now? What is that alliance? Is there any credibility in the alliance anymore?
Well, so Russia has lost Syria, it's lost Venezuela, it's lost Armenia, and it's lost, I believe, it's not 100% certain, but this enclave in Moldova called Transnistria. And so what all this looks like from the outside is that Putin is weak. He's a loser. He's not the all-powerful man that he presented himself to be. That Russia doesn't, as a member of the axis of evil, is not a great ally, and so I don't think anyone can count on Putin, and they understand that. They're seeing it. They're ready to, Putin. Most of these alliances are alliances of convenience, but as we can see, Putin can't maintain them. He can't hold back, the progress of the world. And he's also ready to look the other way. In Venezuela, he basically said nothing. That was supposed to be a proper client state. In Syria, which was very much of a client state, he was able to do nothing. And even Armenia, which was a big ally of Russia, they lost a big territory to Azerbaijan while Russia was supposed to be looking after their security. So Putin is looking like not this all-powerful world leader, superpower. He's looking like, as Obama put it, a weak regional leader, not anything better than that.
One of the winners of the war appears to be China in terms of their manufacturing and providing sort of systems to Russia. Is Russia becoming a resource for China, and is there a global risk in having that situation unfold where Russia is in China's pocket?
Well, I think that if I were to look at it really objectively, of course, it's not pleasant for China to have more influence. It's not pleasant for China to be supposedly aligned with Russia. But I think that the people who have most to fear from China about this relationship are the Russians themselves. So Russia is sitting on one side of the border with huge natural resources and no people. And on the other side of the border, you've got the Chinese with all people and no natural resources. And so it seems pretty logical to me that why would China respect Russia's territorial integrity if they need those natural resources? And by Russia sort of cozying up to China, becoming dependent on China, it's giving the Chinese even more leverage. And I suspect that at some point, China will make a play for parts of Russia because that's the logical thing to do. It may not happen in the next year or two, but that's sort of strategically on the horizon. And it's been absolutely idiotic for Putin to burn his bridges with the West and join China, because the West could have, if he had actually behaved himself, been a counterbalance to the risk that he runs with China.
So you've led the charge on sanctions. After 15 years, has the Magnitsky Act crippled the oligarchs, or have they found new places to hide their billions?
Well, so the Magnitsky Act is I think, a very groundbreaking piece of legislation which changes the whole outlook that bad actors have on the world, which is that they can do bad things in their own country, but then they can't enjoy the ability to travel to and spend their money in civilized countries. And the Magnitsky Act was the template which was then used on Russian oligarchs. And I would say a good majority of the Russian oligarchs are now sanctioned under the template, the Magnitsky template, and had their worldwide assets frozen. Now, of course, they're finding ways around those sanctions. They're finding proxies, family members, other people to hold their assets, hold their money, and do their business for them. And so that's a little bit frustrating. And they've also found ways of bypassing the banking systems of the world. We now have cryptocurrencies, which allow all sorts of bypassing of normal money laundering and sanctions legislation. But the oligarchs are definitely suffering. And any oligarch who's on the US and EU sanctions list, probably spends a good majority of their day talking to lawyers and launching cases, trying to get off the sanctions list, because it basically makes them completely sort of persona non grata in the Western world. And for people who have enjoyed total freedom, total unlimited opportunities, to be told, you're really a nasty piece of work. We don't want to have you travel here, and we're going to freeze your assets. I think it must be very upsetting for the oligarchs, and certainly upsetting for Putin as well.
How has taking on Putin and this corrupt system affected you personally?
Well, since I was responsible for the Magnitsky Act, and since it was passed in December 2012, The Russians have made death threats, kidnapping threats. They've used Interpol 8 times to have me arrested and brought back to Russia. By the way, there was a big story about how Interpol continues to be abused by Russia, which just came out a few days ago in the UK by BBC. They've asked for my extradition from the UK. They've sued me. They've done everything. Putin really took it badly that I created the Magnitsky Act, and he's been chasing me ever since. And the chasing doesn't stop. And so when you go against these people, they really don't have any capacity to stop.